Hi everybody, this is the webinar on the Supreme Court and homelessness, and we'll be starting in just a couple minutes. All right, let's get started. Thank you everyone for attending this webinar on the Supreme Court and its upcoming case of Grants Pass versus Johnson. We're happy to have you here. What we have is a webinar with some of the leading national experts talking about the effect of this case on homelessness. The case, Grants Pass versus Gloria Johnson. The issue is whether a locality can make it a criminal offense to be sleeping outside, even when the locality has not provided any indoor space for shelter or other kinds of protection for people who are homeless. The case again is called Grants Pass versus Gloria Johnson. It started in Grants Pass, Oregon, but it would, because the Supreme Court is ruling, it will affect the entire country. And what we're going to have, we have oral argument from the Supreme Court on April 22nd, which is a week from next Monday. The decision in the case probably won't be for a couple months after that, but is expected by the end of this session, usually in mid-July. Today we have people who will talk about the details of the case and what some of the legal issues involved are, and then also people who will talk in broader sense about what the effect of the case is likely to be throughout the country. So first, let me start with a video that the National Homelessness Law Center has put together that will give you some idea of what the case is about.
Well, what do you think about people being punished for being homeless, and what do you want to say to people who are doing that?
How do you get satisfaction out of torturing and harassing and belittling and poking and jabbing at the people who have nothing, who everything has been taken from? And I wonder what you would be like if you had nothing and everything was taken from you. You have no idea what it is to be at, having everything taken from you. And then because you have nothing, to be treated like you're nothing. And we are more than that. And you don't have the right to treat us like we're nothing.
All right, thank you. A couple of logistical things. If people want to ask questions, there's a Q&A feature. At least on my computer, it's a, a Q&A at the bottom of the screen, but yours might be somewhere else. We'll be monitoring those questions and answering as many of them as we can. And finally, of course, the slides and the recording of the webinar will be sent out to people who have registered and will be placed on the websites of the participating organizations. So now let's get started by hearing from Jesse Rabinowitz, who's the Campaign and Communications Director at the National Homelessness Law Center, and will give us an overview of what this case is about. Jesse, take it away.
Thanks so much, Steve, and thanks to everyone who has helped make this call possible. There's a lot of work going on behind the scenes, and thanks to everyone for taking time out of your busy day to talk a little bit about the most historic and the most important Supreme Court case about homelessness in over 40 years. We can go to the next slide, and let's skip 2 slides ahead. Let's do one more. Amazing. So as I'm sure folks on this call know, there is a national effort to criminalize homelessness throughout the country. A few recent examples are that Florida 3 weeks ago passed a statewide camping ban, making it illegal to camp in the entire state of Florida. And the following week, Kentucky passed a bill that would not only criminalize people for sleeping outside and got funding for housing that we know ends homelessness, they enacted a special provision that would enable folks to enact stand your ground to use force and even deadly force to remove people experiencing homelessness from their property. To be very clear, they made it a lot easier to kill homeless folks who are sleeping on property and just trying to survive. And we know these are happening across the country. We can move to the next slide. There's a well-funded and coordinated effort to criminalize homelessness and take away funding for Housing First programs across the country. And this is our tracker that looks at the statewide efforts being done to criminalize homelessness throughout the country. We know that there are more local and more citywide camping bans and homeless criminalization acts that are happening across the country and that are honestly too numerous for us to list at this point. But we think it's important to name that the same people who are pushing to criminalize homelessness on the state level have their fingerprints all over the Supreme Court case. And in fact, the Cicero Institute, a far right-wing billionaire-backed organization that pushes to criminalize homelessness around the country, filed a friend of the court brief in favor of criminalization, so that we see the Supreme Court case as an outgrowth of the work already existing that is being done in many of our communities to punish folks for having nowhere else to go. We can move to the next slide, and I'll talk a little bit about this case. This case fundamentally asks, does the Constitution protect people experiencing homelessness? And the fact that we even have to ask that question should show how far off, how much we have failed as a country to address the needs of people experiencing homelessness. But we're excited to use this moment in time both to show the Supreme Court that absolutely the Constitution protects everybody, including people who live outside, and to build the power we need to end homelessness throughout the country. Let's move to the next slide. Grants Pass is like many small towns across the country. There are about 40,000 people there, and the population has more than doubled in the past 2 decades, but the supply of housing has not. That means that there's not enough housing to go around. In fact, there's only a 1% vacancy rate. which means that there's not just no affordable housing, there's simply no housing. There's also a long history of racism and racial segregation in Grants Pass. Grants Pass was a former sundown town, and we know that homelessness and racism are deeply tied, and that due to systemic, historic, and current racism, people of color, specifically Black people, are more likely to experience homelessness than other folks. That Black people experience homelessness at disproportionate rates. And we see how Grants Pass, being a former sundown town where they had strict rules around, who is allowed to be in town at night, still plays into the current policy debate and the current reality on what's happening in the ground at Grants Pass. Grants Pass also has no shelter. They have a gospel rescue mission that only lets people stay there if they go to church twice a day, abstain from drugs, sex, and alcohol for the duration of their stay, pay $100 a month to live there, and work for the gospel rescue mission 6 hours a day, 6 days a week. And if folks are too old or too sick to stay there, that means if folks are too old or too sick to work there, they can't stay there at all. So we have these three things happening: no housing, racism, no shelter, equals people stay outside. And instead of responding to homelessness and unsheltered homelessness with things that work, like shelters or housing or services, the city of Grants Pass decided to give people $295 tickets for sleeping outside. Their camping ban is very, very broad and includes using a pillow, using a blanket, using a piece of cardboard. So in the cold Oregon winter, people were really having to make the choice: do I want to stay outside and wrap myself in a blanket in a snowstorm, but risk getting a ticket or going to jail? Or do I want to try to brave the elements? And that's not a choice that any person should have to make. The local government in Grants Pass was very, very clear what their goal was with this ordinance, the $295 ban on camping. And in the court documents, they say that the point is to make it uncomfortable enough so for them, meaning homeless folks in the city, so they will want to move down the road. We're talking to folks from Grants Pass every single day who have only lived in Grants Pass. That is their home, and we know that most people experience homelessness in the places they're from and the places where they have connections and roots. This idea that we're going to just push people out of Grants Pass is not a humane way to respond to homelessness. We can move to the next slide. And I just think it's important to lift up some data. I know we all know that punishing folks for experiencing homelessness doesn't work, but there's new research out that shows that cities that have adopted camping bans actually see an increase in unsheltered homelessness. So we have all our stories, we have our work with our clients that shows that when folks don't have housing, or where folks are thrown in jail, they experience homelessness for longer. And now we have even more data in our toolkit that shows that criminalizing homelessness doesn't work. And we know, and folks on this call know better than most, that the only real solution to homelessness is housing. And it's sad to see cities like Grants Pass focus on throwing people in jail and giving people tickets instead of actually funding the housing that we know ends homelessness. Let's move to the last slide. I'm going to wrap up. Just a few ways for you to get involved. As I mentioned, our goal is not only to win this case, but to build the movement to not only reject criminalization, but build and fund the housing that we need all across the country. We are having a historic rally on April 22nd in DC. Please join us. It's going to be huge. We have people now from over 32 states who are driving and flying and training into DC. We hope you can be there. It's going to be a really impactful day, and that's the day of the oral arguments at the Supreme Court. We also need your help spreading the word about this case. We know that there are a lot of other Supreme Court cases this term, and they are getting more attention, and we know that people don't really like to talk about homelessness. So we see this case getting overshadowed, but we know that when most Americans learn about the cruelty in Grants Pass, their eyes will be open to the harmful effects of criminalization. And we see that as an important way to move the conversation and policies away from criminalization and towards housing. We also have this amazing video project, which you saw one example of. If you have clients who have experienced homelessness and criminalization who you think would be interested in this video project, please reach out. I'll put my email in the chat. And then join us in supporting the Housing Not Handcuffs campaign, which is the umbrella campaign that all this work is nested under. I'm gonna stop for now. and turn it over to the other amazing presenters. Thank you so much for being here, and I'll put my email in the chat.
All right, great. Thanks, Jesse. Now let's turn to our panel. We have today speaking with us Donald Whitehead from the National Coalition for the Homeless, Brooke Shipperwright from the National Low Income Housing Coalition, and Marisol Bello from the Housing Narrative Lab, and then Jesse will be joining the panel as well. So let's start with Donald. Donald, what's planned for the actual oral argument is April 22nd. What's planned for that day? What are you doing? And how can people get involved, especially how can people with lived experience of homelessness get involved?
Thank you, Steve. A great question. So we have really put an effort into making sure that those who are most affected are able to be a part of this particular activity in many different ways. So one of the first things we're doing is we're bringing people physically here. We have buses that are coming from several communities. And I won't be able to name all the communities. I know we're bringing buses from Delaware and Philadelphia and Prince George's County, Maryland, and Baltimore. And so those buses will be filled with advocates and mainly people with lived experience. And on that day, there will also be a series of events for those who can't make it. We obviously understand that everybody can't either get on a bus or be able to travel on their own to DC. So we have about 30 communities that are doing activities in their own communities. We have 13 Western regional organizations that are part of RAP that'll be doing events on that day. We're working with the National Homeless Union. We believe that this is, as Jesse said, one of the most important things that we'll be doing that has happened within the homeless population in the history of modern homelessness. Since the 70s, we've had a couple of really amazing organizing events. Housing Now, people might know of the Kids Day on Capitol Hill. We think this is on the same level. So we're also going to be doing on that day a rally in front of the Supreme Court that'll involve some street theater, some activities that symbolize what it feels like to be outside and unsheltered in our country, hoping to send the message to the Supreme Court that we can't allow human beings to be treated in that way. One thing that most people may not know is that over 50% of the people that are unsheltered are our seniors. We can't treat our seniors or our children or our families in that way. So we'll also be doing a press conference. Some of the individuals who will be actually arguing the case in front of the Supreme Court will be there to do a press conference with members that are on this call and others to share all the specifics and the hope that this is not a one-off. We know that whether we win or lose this case, we have to fight criminalization in a profound way. So we hope that this is a really robust, organized effort, but an effort that continues so we can eliminate criminalization, arresting people and jailing people and giving tickets to people simply because they're homeless across this country. I am going to put in the chat a email for the organizer for NCH, and I lost my video there. Her name is Lynn Lewis. And Lynn, if you email her, if you have an event, I saw a question about how people can organize in their own communities. There is a toolkit that was created by the National Low Income Housing Coalition, an additional bit of information from the National Coalition. So hopefully that answers that question. And Steve, thank you for asking it. And please reach out to us if you want help in organizing an event in your community. So thank you to everybody who's really diligently working on this case. We really appreciate all your efforts, but there's much more we can do. So thank you.
All right, thank you, Donald. Brooke, the Low Income Housing Coalition, of course, is working at the federal level to make housing more available to people with the lowest incomes. Most people on this call know that's the actual solution to unsheltered homelessness. How can people use this moment to advance the solutions that we know really work?
Yeah, it's a great question, Steve. Thank you. You know, this moment and the case, as Jesse was talking about, are consequential in their own right, but regardless of the outcome, at the end of the day, we still need real solutions to end homelessness. And, you know, many of the people on this call know what works to end homelessness. They've just been inadequately funded for decades. And so this case, really, the way that we're looking at it really offers us a chance to have the national spotlight on us and use this moment to lift up real solutions, and as another moment for us all to come together and just continue to strengthen our movement. So like Donald mentioned, we have a toolkit that I will share in the chat just in a minute. The toolkit gives a really good brief overview. Thank you, Elena, for sharing the toolkit. A brief overview of the case like Jesse gave, and then really digs into different types of events that people might consider during that week of action. So we're, you know, there's an amazing event happening in DC on the day of the event, but not everyone can be in DC that day. So in order to make noise about, you know, this case and real solutions to ending homelessness across the country, we are calling for that week to be a week of action to lift up solutions and to show our power as a movement. So the toolkit goes into some how-tos and some sample like guides for how to set up these different events. So some events that are considered in, or that you can consider in there, are meeting with elected officials, press conferences, roundtables, an educational event like a film screening and having a discussion afterwards, or maybe a teach-in. Maybe you want to write, you don't want to host an event, you want to write an op-ed or a letter to the editor instead. We have sample op-eds and letters to the editor for you to use, as well as sample social media you can use to have like a tweet storm or something like that. Another great way to really put on elected officials' radar what solutions are and what that looks like in their community is to invite them to a site visit of an affordable housing development or homelessness program in your community, to meet with people who are directly impacted and to hear about how that program or housing or home has been a positive influence in their lives. So definitely encourage you to utilize that toolkit, and kudos to everyone who contributed to it. And let us know about the events that you're putting together so that we can share those with others who are interested in tapping into one that already exists, and so that we can really amplify the great work that you all are doing. Oh, and sorry, Steve, one other thing. There's a list in that toolkit, last but not least, there is a list of solutions, both at the federal level and solutions at the state and local level that we, you know, would encourage you to lift up.
Great, thanks a lot. Now let's turn to Marisol. When we're talking about narrative, what can you tell us about how to talk about the case when we're talking to people who may not be as familiar with the causes and solutions to homelessness? What are the do's and don'ts for describing what's going on here?
Super wonderful. Thank you so much, Steve, for having me, and thank you so much to my colleagues here on the call. And just as a quick intro, my name is Marisol Bello. I'm with the Housing Narrative Lab, and our work is all about building, helping the public understand the realities of homelessness and housing insecurity so we can build the support for the very solutions that we're talking about here today. Also, I use she, her, aya pronouns. And so I'd love to talk about I'm going to point folks to three do's, and the don'ts might be embedded in there. So it's more about three areas you want to embrace. The first is around storytelling, and Jesse mentioned the wonderful project that they are working on, video project that they are working on. I can't stress that enough, right? The stories that we tell are powerful. Stories are the way that we can help people change hearts and then their minds and get them to action. And this is why the kinds of stories we tell really matter, right? Because stories are stories that help people connect the realities, stories of people that are left without a home because of rent hikes, or they've lost a job, or other life changes that have left them with little option but to live out in the streets or be in their cars or not have a stable place to live, are really important. And so storytelling allows us, and having as many stories out there with all of the varying experiences, allow us to really flood the zones with all kinds of content. So video contents like the amazing video that we saw, graphics, GIFs, memes, everything that we can. Brooke mentioned op-eds. Jesse showed us a video where we'll have a link to some GIFs that our partners at Into Action have created around housing that you can use on social media. So you can see it's really about how we can get all of the kinds of stories out there that we can. So that's the first thing. The second thing that I think is going to be really important is connecting the solutions to the issue. Folks get housing affordability. They understand how expensive housing is. They understand that housing is a basic need that more and more of us can't afford. People get that. So they are increasingly seeing the economic factors that are at play and that are root causes to why people are losing stable housing. Here's where we face some of the narrative tensions. They also think that if people are living on the street, they're there because of different root causes. And those root causes very specifically are substance use and mental health. They're not making connections about the economic factors that lead people to live on the street who may not have other options available to them. And so that's why it becomes really important to have a whole breadth and variety of stories that we tell. Because if we only focus on one kind of story, then we end up inadvertently reinforcing harmful stereotypes that people already have. Right? So that's where that kind of scale, consistency, and repetition becomes so key. All of us telling a lot of different kinds of stories, and then being able to connect the solutions to the issue. And then the last thing that I will point to, and Jesse talked a little bit about this, really important to talk about how tickets and fines leave people, and arrests leave people more unhoused, leave people with more instability, right? That really the only way to get them safe and stable is housing. And once they're in housing, they get the services that they need to help them thrive, be healthy, be productive members of our society, all the things that we all want. Notice that in nothing I've said have I used the word criminalization. We use that in, obviously our field uses the phrase criminalization. We are actually, one of the things I was going to point to is that we are doing some narrative research with our partners at the National Homelessness Law Center, really digging into this question. And the word criminalization is not something that people are responding to as much. They're not kind of quite getting what we're saying here, right? But when we say people, cities and police are arresting people, they're ticketing people, they're fining people because they have nowhere else to go except to be on the street, they get that. That's a real tangible thing that folks get. We give them real examples, like a woman who lives in Grants Pass, and now is living in the shelter that Jesse mentions earlier, the church shelter. But when she was outside, the city levied $6,000 in fines to her. $6,000. How is this woman now going to thrive and get herself into any measure of stability if she has $6,000 in fines? I just keep repeating that number, right? Because it's a pretty astounding thing. So the three things that we want to be thinking about as we are telling these powerful stories are variety of different kinds of stories, connecting, right, the solution to the issue, and then pointing very specifically to what we actually mean when we say criminalization. Arrests, tickets, and fines that leave people with more instability and makes it harder for them to become stable and healthy and thriving and all the things that we need. And then lastly, I'll just say, please keep an eye out, because as I mentioned, this research that we are doing with our partners at the Law Center is really looking at both this case, but also looking at this case and beyond, because obviously this is an issue we want to continue to build support around for the solutions. And then in the meantime, we have at the lab created a message guide that our partners can share in the chat, or that I will share in the chat. And I'll also include my email for anyone that also would like to reach out with a little bit more specificity here. Thank you all so much. Thanks, Steve.
All right, thanks a lot. And then just back to Jesse one more time. Jesse, what do you see in terms of what's going on in other parts of the country besides Grants Pass, Oregon? What's the rest of the trend that's going on that is either the same or different than that?
Absolutely. As I mentioned at the top, both Florida and Kentucky have passed laws criminalizing homelessness, and this is part of a coordinated effort from far right-wing billionaires who are working to target states right now. Arizona is, there's a lot of attention in Arizona, to not only criminalize homelessness, but also take away funding for proven solutions like Housing First. And they're really effective in how they communicate about this. I think that's something to piggyback on what Marisol was talking about. They are super persuasive. They are super on message. They know how to talk about homelessness in ways that move people who just don't want to see people experiencing homelessness. And then often we come at them with, housing is a human right, and here's all the reasons why getting folks into housing is good, which are true. But it's time for us to shift in how we're talking about things, to move away from these stats and figures on tax savings and things like that and wonky policy language, and remind folks that when we put someone in jail, they stay homeless longer. When we give someone a ticket, they stay homeless longer. And to be really honest, that the reasons that I don't want to see people outside are probably really different than the reasons that the business down the street don't want to see homelessness outside. But the truth is, neither of us want to see folks outside. And it's really important opportunity for us to come in and say, the thing that you are proposing, this use of tickets or fines, is the worst possible thing you can do, and will mean that you are always going to see homelessness because you're not actually getting at the solution. So I'm going to put in the link in the chat a link to the Housing.Handcuffs website, and on there we have a map that tracks the statewide efforts to criminalize homelessness. But I want to close on a hopeful note, that is, we've beat these people in many, many states from across the country. We are a scrappy movement of small local nonprofits primarily, and we are beating back billionaires all across the country. As Steve mentioned, and I think was mentioned in the chat, last week we submitted 42 friend of the court briefs on behalf of over 1,100 individuals in favor of Gloria Johnson and against criminalizing homelessness. Whether they knew it or not, these folks who want to throw homeless folks in jail have awoken a sleeping giant, and we are going to respond. We are responding. We're going to be responding in person on April 22nd, and we're going to respond and mobilize as long as we need to, not only to stop the criminalization of homelessness, but to ensure that every single person in this country has access to housing that meets their needs. Thanks, Elena, for putting it in the chat.
All right, thanks a lot. Now we got plenty of time for questions for these panelists. Again, if you want to ask a question, put it in the Q&A monitor. It's at the bottom of my screen. It might be somewhere else on your screen. But feel free to ask, and we've got people looking through those, and we'll do as many as we can. So the first, for whoever would like to answer, a lot of people are interested in what the potential consequences are going to be. If the Supreme Court rules in favor of the city of Grants Pass, what will that actually do to other people around the country?
Yeah, and I'll lump this in with some questions in the chat about what we think is going to happen. We have absolutely no idea. What we do know is that every time a court has heard this question about, is it cruel and unusual to punish people for sleeping outside, they have agreed with us. There is no discrepancy in what any court has decided. And we feel confident that the justices on April 22nd will hear that truth. To be honest, we also don't know how narrow or how broad the court will rule. Just for a piece of timing, as Steve mentioned, the oral arguments are on April 22nd, and we anticipate the result of this case to be announced probably the last week of June. We just don't know what's going to happen, but I think it's important for us to provide examples on what could happen. And one of those examples is Miami. Miami was under a consent decree that said the city of Miami could not punish folks experiencing homelessness. The leaders in Miami still didn't want to see people living outside, again, for probably very different reasons than you and I don't want to see people living outside, but the government removed the criminalization tool from their tool belt. So Miami funded a lot of housing and reduced homelessness by 90%. When that consent decree was withdrawn, the city of Miami again began criminalizing homelessness, and homelessness went back up. But we have to point to this proof point that Miami used things that we know work, like housing and services, to reduce homelessness by 90%, and that's remarkable. The Supreme Court could, say you can't criminalize homelessness, which would then likely force other cities to take the Miami approach. Or the Supreme Court could say you can use the civil legal system to criminalize folks. They might say they might share that you could use the legal system to throw folks in jail. We just don't know, but we do think that on April 22nd, we'll get a better sense of what the court's thinking when we listen to their oral arguments and hear what sort of questions the justices are asking.
And Jesse, I would just add it also, there is some precedent. I mean, the Martin versus Boise case in the Ninth Circuit did force communities to think more creatively about solutions to homelessness, because in that particular ruling, it was stated that communities could not criminalize people experiencing homelessness unless they had enough shelter. So I think it did result in an increase in communities looking at solutions that were humane and compassionate and creating more shelter opportunities. I think this case is a result of the effects of that case. But if this case is decided by the Supreme Court, it becomes, it to me validates that this can be done across the country. And so in places where we aren't seeing that criminalization, we believe that it could open the door to criminalization in places we haven't seen it. We've already seen a move from progressive communities to actually start to look at criminalization as a solution.
All right, so the next question, there are several that are about the same, so let me paraphrase several of them. I think people on the call, as we talked about before, and certainly on this panel, have an idea that housing is really the solution to homelessness, and fines and tickets and jailing are not. So how can we is there anything about the case happening now, or the way it's coming down, or the kinds of responses it's generating that can help us get that message across, either at the federal level or states and localities where different people are working?
I can jump on that one. I think what it's done is it's unleashed a sleeping giant, if you will, because over the last few years, one of the missing pieces to our strategies to address homelessness, in my opinion, has been grassroots organizing. So Jesse talked about some of the local efforts that are going on, but as far as a collaborative national effort to really show the number of people in this country who truly care about people experiencing homelessness. We haven't seen that. We saw it years ago, and every time we saw a collective action where we started to really organize with people with lived experience on behalf of people with lived experience, we've seen change. So we had Housing Now, as I referenced in my earlier comments, where we brought hundreds of thousands of people to DC to say enough is enough. We won't stand for the treatment of homeless people that is not compassionate. And then we had the Education of Homeless Children and Youth Act that was passed as a result of grassroots organizing with children. We brought kids to Capitol Hill for Kids Day on Capitol Hill, and that legislation passed. So I think that's been missing for the last 20 years or so, just really strong organizing efforts. The criminalization started a path back towards that, and I think this only enhances the willingness and collaboration between community-based advocates to really challenge the status quo.
Anybody else? Thank you, Donald. All right, are there other things that are happening the day of the argument on April 22nd that we didn't quite get to? Or what can people be doing at their local, if they can't make it to DC, who can they be in touch with, who can they get help from to set something up in their local community?
Okay, I wanted to
You want to start that one?
yes, I wanted to give space for other people, but I put an email address for Lynn Lewis in the chat. Lynn and Jesse and his team are working to provide support to give people ideas in the Low-Income Housing Coalition with the toolkit on what they can do in their local community. And also we have a document that provides some examples of things that are happening across the country. The other thing that we want to do on the day of that I didn't mention is we want to have a after action briefing to talk about takeaways, what we can do the day after April 22nd, or the day after we actually hear the final disposition in June, probably. So we want to figure out the path forward. We don't want to rest on our laurels and make this a one-off event. We want to have a plan for what communities and definitely those who are present on April 22nd can do moving forward.
And I'll just add, you know, Donald and Jesse and their teams are crushing it with the day of events. So always appreciate you giving space, but you're a rock star and you gotta you gotta own it. And so they're really doing really great work planning that event. And they've been really, I know, supportive to advocates around the country to setting up events, especially folks who are new to advocacy or maybe new to, you know, hosting an event in their community. And that's also what the toolkit that I mentioned is for. It doesn't maybe go walk people through all of the things like what to expect that I know Donald and his team have talked about before, but it does give some step-by-steps to really, if you're brand new to this, to kind of give you some guidance along the way. And so encourage folks to check that out, but also, again, to be in touch with Donald's team or my team. We're happy to support folks. In the pre-pandemic times, we used to host Week of Actions, and that this kind of morphed from some of the resources we had from that. So we're not new to supporting folks and hosting these types of events, and we're happy to. And I think, Steve, you also asked like some of the types of events that are happening around the country. Things that we know about so far range from, you know, a rally at the local courthouse or maybe the state house, a call-in day to their members of Congress, social media, Twitter storms, panel discussions and inviting elected officials and service providers to join, and a whole bunch of other stuff that we're continuing to learn about. So yeah, really appreciate all of the work of the people and their teams on this call, but also the advocates around the country who are just jumping in and organizing stuff right away.
Can I also just do a quick add to something that Brooke was saying about social media? How important it is for us to really use this moment to flood the zone with all of our voices. In Indiana, in Oklahoma, in California, in Seattle, all across Washington, D.C. Can you imagine all of the TikToks, all of the Instagram reels, all of the social media posts with all of our voices across the country saying housing is how you solve homelessness, saying everyone needs a place to call home, really zeroing in on how housing is a basic need, it's a dignity, all the things, right? Really use that moment to record a 10, 20-second video of yourself at a rally, pictures of signs. Like, this is your moment to be the content creator du jour. Let's use it.
And I would add one more thing. Don't forget the policy as well. We know that organizing is really, really important, but don't forget the policy. One of the things we know about April 22nd is Congress is in recess. And so we will have members of Congress there. They're truly committed members of Congress, by the way, but other members will be in their home offices. So it's a really good chance while you do that action to really address your local officials, because a lot of these decisions are made at the local level when it comes to criminalization. Jesse, you're going to say something?
And one just quick point that I think a few folks have alluded to. First, check out our website, johnsonvgrants.com. My colleague Sam made an amazing website that was just quoted in a Newsweek article last week, so it's getting a lot of traction. There you can see all of the amicus efforts, all the friend of the court briefs. We also have a social media toolkit. That's also the landing page for the rally, and we will be sharing hopefully later this week templates of signs and banners that people can use to print off in their local communities, so that we have consistent signage and messaging throughout the country, which will make us look even more coordinated than we already are. So please feel free to keep checking back to that website with any questions for resources.
All right, thanks. Another question, different versions of the same question has come up. For people to get information about research data that shows that criminal prosecution doesn't really work to resolve homelessness and that housing and services do work, what are people's favorite places to look for that kind of information? I would personally look at the National Alliance to End Homelessness website, but I know there's other places you can find it too. What do people got?
Well, there's great research on the National Healthcare for the Homeless website that really talks about the impact of criminalization on people experiencing homelessness and goes through many categories of health-related issues. There's a community solutions report that looks at how dollars are being spent in communities, and it really points to the fact that many of those dollars are criminal justice dollars when it comes to outreach to homeless communities. There's also a study that was done. I'm gonna blank on who actually was behind the study, but it talks about mortality and the really dire consequences when people are sleeping outside and forced to sleep outside longer. We have a study that'll be released Friday, hopefully, on another aspect of this that sometimes goes underreported, and that's what it does to people in terms of location and isolation, and how that can result in more violence against people experiencing homelessness. So we'll be releasing a report on that issue as well. And I know, Jesse, you guys have a wealth of research as well.
Well, I think one thing to do is to actually think about what information we're trying to convey and what the best way is to convey it. Most people aren't going to sit down and read a research paper. Most people are going to read maybe the top line or the bullets. So I think like we're all so smart and we're so in the weeds and like, right, I have my whole stack of research to read right next to me. But local elected officials don't have time to do that. Most of the people we're trying to convince don't care, or don't care enough that they're going to read a research paper. So I think it's on us to figure out, how are we presenting this information in ways that are accessible and approachable to not only change the narrative, but to actually build the power we need to end homelessness. So I would actually say, tell a story, right? Tell a personal story, help someone understand the real life implications of this. And if they're a nerd like I am, sure, send them the research. But I think our gut for the first thing to be research is actually not helping us at this moment in time. And we should be shifting away from wonky data reports towards, honestly, like short videos, TikToks, things that people actually consume, and that can quickly convey our message.
You know, I 100% everything that Jesse and Donald just mentioned. And I also, you know, I'm at the Housing First Partners Conference today. And one of the things we were talking about early this morning, because people were asking us about qualifications for being able to get housing and benefits cliffs, and how do you talk about all of the kind of nuts and bolts of our work, which is to the point of the research and all of those pieces. And the analogy that I and other narrative folks use is often the brownie, and thinking about, like, we focus a lot in our work on how to do a thing, the process. So if I were going to make a brownie, I'm going to tell you, if I were in our field, you have to put the oven at 400 degrees. You need this kind of pan. You need to put this amount of pieces. And then we take a picture of all of that. And in the process, I never really tell you that at the end of doing this whole thing, what you are going to get is chocolate, gooey, wonderful, warm goodness. I never give you a picture of that. I never tell you that that's the thing that's going to happen. And so to Jesse and Donald's point, right? Thinking about what is the thing at the end. All this research is so powerful and so important. The policy work, so powerful, so important. But why are we doing all of this? Because at the end of all of this, this is what the vision actually looks like. And presenting that consistently and repeatedly to people will help bring them in. And once they're in, to the organizing point about you have to go through the ladder of engagement, then you can start moving them through the individual pieces and processes depending on where they're at. But you're not going to get them in on the process. You're not going to get them in on the wonk. You're not going to get them in on all of those pieces. It's more on the, like, who are we? Why are we doing this? And what is it that we're trying to achieve?
Now I just want brownies, Marisol. But I love that. I love that.
So do I, actually.
Which is exactly the point. Okay, so here's a legalistic question. How would this case affect other cases that are out there, like the Martin versus Boise case in the Ninth Circuit? And there are other cases in other circuits that have sort of said similar things as the Grants Pass versus Johnson appellate court said. How does this affect those other cases?
Sure. Martin versus Boise is really asks, can the criminal legal system be used? So things like jails and handcuffs, which the court said that no, you cannot do that. What Grants Pass looks at is, can you also use the civil legal system? So not handcuffs or jail cells, but things like fines and tickets. And what the court said, which makes sense, is, you know, if you're living outside and you get a ticket and you can't pay the ticket, that'll eventually turn into a warrant, and then you'll eventually get thrown in jail, which takes us back to the criminal legal system, which Martin versus Boise said we can't use. So Johnson v. Grants Pass kind of clarifies that you can use neither the criminal legal system or the civil legal system to punish folks for sleeping outside. We're hearing that courts across the country have cases before them about how they're going to proceed around homeless criminalization, and they are on pause right now to see what the Supreme Court does. So the impacts of this will likely be pretty swift and pretty significant if, unfortunately, the Supreme Court rules that the Constitution does not protect homeless people. But it doesn't mean that states have to criminalize homelessness. There are still things that we can do on the state level. Like, I think the Dobbs case is a good example, that we can pass state level bills or laws that say you cannot criminalize homelessness. we can pass bills that support housing and services. But it would make it, if the Supreme Court rules against Grants Pass, or I'm sorry, rules in favor of Grants Pass and against Gloria Johnson, it would make it a lot easier for the states to do harmful things to address homelessness, like jail cells and fines.
All right, thank you. Another question is coming. Someone mentioned older adults as a growing part of the homeless population. Do these issues of using criminal penalties affect older adults more? How does that trend sort of fit in with the importance of this case?
So my point about older adults is they're right now the largest growing sector of the homeless population. There was a webinar last week with the national about, and this number is a real number from their studies. So it's a large number. So I just want you to realize that it's a real number, that when they look at veteran homelessness, they make up about, older adults make up about 40% of the population. But the growth, if nothing changes in elder homelessness, will be somewhere in the neighborhood of, I think they said 300% over the next 30 years. So we have an emerging problem. I think it actually was 352%, if I'm not mistaken. But we have a problem for many different reasons, and we probably don't have enough time. Older adults do tend to stay outside at a higher level than the general population. And those older adults are adults over 55 because of shelters, because of the lack of the accommodations in shelters, the lack of plugs for medical devices. There's a whole list of things that push people that are over 55 into the unsheltered population. And this would have an impact. So the people, because theoretically, and there's not a study that says this, if more people are in unsheltered situations, more of those people will receive fines and tickets and be put in jail. And you know, it creates a whole different dilemma for them. So it would affect, I believe, because it's the largest growing sector of the population, the senior population disproportionately. And I don't know if others have anything that they wanted to share on that.
I think this is just another time to remind people, like, instead of when we talk about older adults, say like people like my grandparents or people like my parents, just to help people put a face on the issue.
And I think that is so helpful, Jesse, because you know, people might be able to not have compassion when it comes to a teenager who's experiencing homelessness, or people in the youth population. But you can't look at your grandparents or your parents and be okay with them not only living on the streets, but them being criminalized for living on the streets. So it does provide an opportunity for us to put a face that people have some compassion or sympathy for. And I hope we do take advantage of that. Seems weird to say take advantage of kind of this growing population, but from a messaging standpoint, it's an opportunity for us to really to get some support for people that most people support anyway.
Okay, one last question. Marisol and others have pointed out the importance of telling stories, and we have many people in the Q&A and on other webinars we do who are unhoused now or have been in the past and feel like they want to tell their story, but they need some help telling it and getting it out to the people who need to hear it. Where can people in that situation go to get that help?
Yeah, I can kick us off, certainly. If you go to our website, the Housing Narrative Lab, all of our work is open and available, and available for all of our partners to access and to share. So that's the first thing. You will have there's a wealth of toolkits and resource guides, etc. The second one is I've put my email there, so feel free to reach out. We do a lot of webinars and storytelling. It's so important for people to be able to tell their stories. telling your story is not just about being able to bring someone into your shoes. It's how we can kind of build empathy and connect with people. So when you can tell your story effectively, then you're able to share with people for folks to be able to kind of start to understand, right, your perspective and your lived experience. But to get there requires you and others to be able to figure out how are we telling our stories effectively. And that's leadership. Like a lot of that is you being a leader in your story. That's your leadership, that's your advocacy. I will point to many of our partners here on the call, like Donald can absolutely please talk about the speakers program that Donald has. Our partners at CSH also have a Speak Up program as well. We do a lot of training around lived experience at the lab as well. And so there are a lot of organizations that are providing this level of training, coaching, and advocacy, because at the end, this is also really critically a leadership, a point of leadership as well, and building powerful advocates.
And I'll just quickly add to that, 100% agree what Marisol shared. That is like what we are getting into more and more of hearing from media outlets and hearing from members of Congress, wanting to hear from people who are directly impacted. And we're building these relationships across the country with folks who have been directly impacted and trying to find different ways to lift up their stories. So I'll share two things in the chat. You can contact your members of Congress and share your story on the phone and an email and on Twitter. We have those tools readily available, and you can edit it so that you tell your story in that outlet. You can also email me or our general inbox, outreach@nlhc.org. I'll also put that in the chat to say that you're interested in sharing your story on our blog. We have a monthly blog post to share people's stories, whether we do an interview with you or you author it yourself. And then we have that to point to when members of Congress are asking about someone who's experienced a certain issue in affordable housing and homelessness. So I will share that in the chat and definitely encourage you to reach out. And thank you for wanting to share your story.
All right, thank you so much to our speakers today. You know, again, the case is being, the oral argument is April 22nd. The decision will be out probably some summer. There's lots to do right now and between now and April 22nd, and there will be win or lose or somewhere in between. There will be a lot of work to do to get the right messages across and to use this as an opportunity to get the right messages across, using storytelling to do that, and connecting what we know to be the solutions to this issue. So thank you again. All the materials, the slides, and all the answers to the questions that we didn't get to will be up and sent to people who registered and will be made available online. Have a great day, and we hope we'll see you somewhere on the 22nd.
Thanks, everyone.